They built it to defend and to warn. In the 11th century London, as Norman forces took control, a single stone tower rose by the river. It would outlast kings, wars, and centuries. The Tower of London. To some, it was a fortress. To others, a royal palace. But for many, it was something far darker, a machine of death. Within its thick, silent walls, queens were beheaded, spies were shot, and innocents were tortured. The walls never spoke, and the blood-soaked ground never fully dried. This wasn't just where history happened. This was where power punished. From the ceremonial scaffold on Tower Green to the mass crowds screaming at Tower Hill, executions weren't just punishments. They were performances, calculated, ritualized, often botched, and always unforgettable. So what exactly happened behind those gates? What twisted methods did England's most feared executioners perfect? And why do the echoes of their victims still haunt the tower today? This is not just a history lesson. This is a tour through the tower's darkest legacy, one gruesome method at a time. The Tower of London wasn't just built to protect the city, it was built to dominate it. Commissioned in 1078 by William the Conqueror, the tower's message was clear. The Normans were here to stay, and resistance would be crushed. The White Tower, its central keep, stood over 90 feet high, with stone walls thick enough to shrug off a siege. Built from Kentish ragstone and reinforced with fine Caen stone imported from Normandy, it was a brutal blend of intimidation and engineering. Its placement wasn't random. It loomed over the Thames, England's commercial artery, so every merchant, noble or rebel approaching the capital saw exactly who held power. But this wasn't just a castle, it was a machine of state. Each monarch left their mark. Richard the Lionheart added the moat. Henry III turned the interior into royal apartments, painting roses and lining chambers with seasonal branches. His renovations included private chapels and walls lined with imported tapestries. These weren't decorations, they were armor, a message that even beauty here served the crown. By the 13th century, the tower had evolved. It became not only a royal residence, but a hub of state power. It minted England's currency. It housed the crown jewels, including the Cullinan diamond, the largest gem-quality stone ever found. It stockpiled enough arms under Elizabeth II to arm 15,000 men. Exotic animals like lions and a polar bear from Norway were paraded from its menagerie, sent to fish in the Thames on a leash. All of it, gold, weapons, beasts, sat behind stone walls sharpened with fear. This concentration of power made the tower more than a fortress. It was now the core of England's political body, the treasury, the arsenal, the throne room, and eventually, the dungeon. And the transformation wasn't slow. By the early 12th century, it began housing prisoners. Not criminals, political enemies. Bishops, lords, diplomats, even queens. The walls that once hosted coronation banquets soon echoed with chains. Its dual identity took shape, half palace, half prison. And every Tudor, Plantagenet, or Yorkist knew if you rose too fast or spoke too loudly, your path could end behind these walls. The architecture evolved with this paranoia. Guard towers were expanded, iron bars sealed windows, gates were redesigned not just to keep invaders out, but prisoners in. Records from the Royal Mint show that by 1279, the tower struck over 4 million silver pennies in a single year. Meanwhile, prison ledgers quietly listed names destined for the axe. That contrast, wealth and death, opulence and dread, is what made the tower so feared. It didn't need to be covered in blood. It just had to remind you it could be. It wasn't the largest fortress in England, but it was the most dangerous. Because once inside, the question was never, when will I leave? It was, will I leave at all? The Tower of London was never designed to be a prison, but power changes plans. Originally built as a fortress and royal residence, it gradually absorbed a darker function. Quietly, then relentlessly. The first recorded prisoner was Ranulph Flambard, the Bishop of Durham. In 1100, under King Henry I, Flambard was thrown into the White Tower for embezzlement. But what made his case historic wasn't just the crime, it was the escape. He organized a feast for his guards, smuggled a rope in a wine cask, and climbed down from a window under cover of night. It embarrassed the crown, exposed weaknesses in the tower's security, and forced a redesign. Bars were fitted to windows, entrances were reinforced, and most importantly, the tower's role shifted. It began to specialize in confinement. Unlike ordinary jails, the tower was reserved for political threats. High-value detainees, nobles, foreign envoys, and anyone the monarchy couldn't risk leaving alive or letting die too publicly. The tower gave kings the power to punish without spectacle, to interrogate without scrutiny, and to delay execution for reasons that had nothing to do with mercy. Its location made it ideal, isolated by the Thames and protected by multiple layers of stone and guards. It was far enough from Westminster to offer secrecy, but close enough to Parliament to send a message. Any time a figurehead of rebellion vanished behind those walls, the country took notice. That was the point. By the 13th century, the Tower had become known as the state prison, not by law, but by practice. Monarchs began using it regularly to detain enemies of the throne. During the Wars of the Roses, both Yorkists and Lancastrians cycled through its cells, depending on who wore the crown that week. By the time the Tudors rose to power, the Tower's prison status was sealed. Inside, conditions varied drastically by rank. Nobles were given private rooms, access to books, servants, and even gardens. Commoners were crammed into dank, rat-infested chambers. But the real punishment was psychological. Most prisoners weren't told how long they'd be held, or whether they'd ever leave. Some waited years in limbo, listening as executions took place just outside. Graffiti became their only voice. Etchings, still visible in the Beauchamp Tower, speak of loyalty, fear, and betrayal. The name Jane, believed to have been carved by Lord Guildford Dudley before his execution, stands among dozens of others. Crests, prayers, pleas to God. For many, the act of carving their names was an act of defiance, proof that they existed, even as the Crown tried to erase them. Even the methods of imprisonment evolved. Interrogations became more systematic. Guards were rotated, cells were outfitted with chains and built-in restraints. The Salt Tower, originally a defensive turret, became a solitary cell for those accused of treason or witchcraft. The tower adapted itself to contain both physical bodies and political threats. Over time, imprisonment here became a sentence unto itself, without trial, without conviction, sometimes without crime. And yet, its true punishment was not the iron or the stone. It was the silence, the waiting, the knowledge that within these walls forgetting was easy and being forgotten was permanent. Inside the Tower of London, history isn't just written in records, it's scratched into the stone. The Tower's prisoners, silenced by law and stripped of power, found their voices in the walls. With nails, knives, and sometimes just broken shards, they left behind names, crests, dates, prayers, even full inscriptions. These weren't random markings, they were last declarations, final testimonies etched in limestone, meant to outlive their creators. The Beauchamp Tower contains the highest concentration of these carvings. Each one tells a story. Anne Askew, burned for her Protestant beliefs in 1546, left a cryptic set of initials and symbols believed to be part of a secret religious code. Philip Howard, the 13th Earl of Arundel, imprisoned for his Catholic faith, carved a Latin phrase still visible today. Quanto plus afflictiones pro Christo in hoc saeculo, tanto plus gloriae cum Christo in futuro. The more affliction we endure for Christ in this world, the more glory we gain with Christ in the next. His fate, like so many others, was sealed not by law but by loyalty. Wrong religion, wrong monarch, wrong moment in history. The most haunting of all might be the single word Jane, carved low on the stone wall, delicate, careful, final. It's widely believed to be the work of Lord Guildford Dudley, husband to Lady Jane Grey, England's 9-day queen. The two were held in separate towers and executed on the same morning in 1554. Jane's own final words, recorded in a tiny prayer book, were addressed to her father. "In that you have condemned me, God will forgive you." Graffiti wasn't limited to the noble or famous. Unnamed prisoners carved crosses, cryptic messages, and sometimes just tally marks, counting days that never ended. For some, it was a way to hold on to sanity. For others, it was their only act of resistance. These walls became confessionals, journals, and gravestones. Even the materials used tell a story. The stone in the Beauchamp Tower was soft enough to carve with a spoon, which many prisoners used. Guards often confiscated tools, but some prisoners bribed their way into keeping knives under the guise of eating utensils. In rare cases, prisoners were granted writing tools, but even then, ink fades. Stone survives. Graffiti became a kind of parallel archive, a shadow history untouched by censorship. It tells us not only who was held inside, but how they endured. The fear, the loyalty, the defiance, it's all there, embedded in rough carvings that still catch the light. Some messages are purely symbolic: Tudor roses, falcons, chained hearts. Others are chillingly direct. One prisoner left a message that simply reads, "It is better to suffer for the truth than prosper in silence." In many ways, these markings are more powerful than any record or chronicle. They weren't meant for scholars or judges. They were meant for us, for anyone who might someday stand in the same cell and wonder who came before. Not everyone who entered the tower left a body, but those who left a name carved it deep, hoping history would remember what the Crown tried to erase. At the Tower of London, executions weren't just punishments. They were procedures, calculated, rehearsed, and laced with ritual. The men who carried them out were not random brutes. They were professionals, and what they did wasn't a job. It was a sentence with a price, one paid in coin, in blood, and in mental ruin. Executioners at the tower were trained and often selected based on lineage. Many inherited the role as if brutality passed through bloodlines. One of the most infamous was Richard Brandon, who served during the 17th century and is widely believed to have beheaded King Charles I. Though he wore a mask, Brandon's identity was eventually exposed. He admitted on his deathbed that the king's ghost haunted his dreams. The tower had its own methods: beheading for nobles, hanging for commoners. Beheadings were the most high profile. They required precision. A skilled executioner could end a life in one clean stroke. But when skill failed, death came slowly: hacked bone, splintered spine, screams that lingered. The weapon mattered. The axe was the most common, weighing roughly 7 pounds with a blade over 18 inches wide. But for select individuals, especially royalty, a sword was used. More honourable, more expensive. When Anne Boleyn was sentenced to die, Henry VIII summoned a French executioner known for his sword work. He was paid the equivalent of tens of thousands in today's money, not for mercy, but for performance. The block itself was crafted from solid oak, designed with a carved depression to hold the neck steady. Some had leather bindings, others were simple. But they were always cleaned. Straw lined the base to absorb blood. Executioners washed their blades in vinegar and sometimes scented oils, not out of respect, but to dull the stench of death. Before each execution, a set ritual was followed. The executioner would ask forgiveness from the condemned. It wasn't for legal reasons, it was psychological. If the prisoner granted it, the weight of guilt lessened. Some executioners recited the same prayer before every kill. Grant me strength to serve justice with mercy. Many practiced the night before. They swung their axes at pumpkins filled with wine or animal carcasses from the tower's kitchens to simulate the feel of human flesh. Accuracy mattered, not out of compassion, but for order. Botched executions invited riots. Clean ones meant the crowd stayed silent. The tower also kept detailed inventories of tools, axes, swords, blocks, hoods. One record from 1597 lists whale fat for blade oiling and salt-packed leather wraps to prevent rust. Tools were sharpened by hand, tested before dawn, and stored under guard. Executioners wore dark garments, leather aprons to block spray, masks for anonymity, and on royal occasions, ceremonial hoods. These weren't disguises, they were uniforms, symbols of finality. One executioner wrote in his log, "We dress for the dead as priests do for the divine." The job paid well, but came at a cost. Depression, isolation, paranoia. Many executioners lived alone, drank heavily or turned to religion. They delivered death by day and ran from ghosts by night. And for every head they took, a part of themselves stayed behind, buried not in the ground, but in the tower walls. The Tower of London became infamous not just for the prisoners it held, but for the ones it killed. And no place symbolized that more than Tower Green. Unlike Tower Hill, where public executions drew thousands, Tower Green was reserved for the elite. Executions there were private, silent, and controlled, witnessed by no more than a few hundred eyes. But that silence didn't make them cleaner. In fact, it made them worse. The air was thick with ceremony, but the outcome never changed. The most famous of them all was Anne Boleyn. She entered the Tower in May 1536, no longer the Queen of England, but a condemned woman accused of adultery, incest, and treason. Most historians agree the charges were fabricated. Her real crime was failing to produce a male heir. In those final days, Anne was held in the Queen's house, under tight guard. Yet according to reports from Sir William Kingston, the Tower's constable, she faced death with a strange mix of fear and wit. She laughed nervously. She joked about the French executioner. "I have a little neck," she said, wrapping her hands around her throat. Her ladies wept. Anne prayed. On the morning of May 19th, she stepped onto the scaffold dressed in a grey gown, red underskirt, and ermine cloak. Her hair was tucked under a simple cap. The French swordsman, brought in at great expense, waited silently behind her. Anne gave her final words, kneeling upright, head held high. Witnesses say the executioner distracted her by calling for his assistant, then struck from behind. The blade fell so swiftly, her lips were still moving in prayer when her head hit the straw. Her body was hastily buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula nearby, under a stone marked only years later. But Anne was not the only queen to die there. 18 years later, Lady Jane Grey, England's 9-day queen, met the same fate. Barely 17, she had been a pawn in political chess. When Mary I claimed the throne, Jane was deemed a usurper. Her imprisonment in the Tower was brief, but devastating. Kept in relative comfort, she was offered a chance to convert to Catholicism and spare her life. She refused. On February 12, 1554, Jane walked to the scaffold dressed in black, a small prayer book clutched in her hand. According to eyewitness accounts, she remained composed until the very end. But when she was blindfolded, she panicked, unable to find the block. "Where is it? What shall I do?" she cried, groping through the darkness. A bystander guided her hands. She laid her head down. The axe fell. Minutes later, her husband, Lord Guildford Dudley, was executed on Tower Hill. The Crown had erased them both, quietly, efficiently. Sir Thomas More, once Lord Chancellor of England, was another casualty of the Tower's shifting loyalties. He refused to acknowledge Henry VIII as head of the Church of England and was imprisoned in the Bell Tower. For over a year, he wrote by candlelight using scraps of parchment smuggled by his daughter Margaret. He was beheaded on July 6, 1535, on Tower Hill. According to accounts, he climbed the scaffold and told the executioner, "See me safe up, and for my coming down let me shift for myself." He died with dignity. His legacy lived on in ink. But not all deaths at the Tower came with grace. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, was 67 when she was dragged to the scaffold in 1541. She refused to lay her head on the block, declaring she was no traitor. The executioner, inexperienced and panicked, chased her around the platform, swinging wildly. It took over 10 blows to kill her. Blood soaked the scaffold. Witnesses turned away in horror. Then there were the nameless ones, men and women executed not for treason, but for espionage. During World War I, the Tower was reactivated as a site for execution. 11 German spies were shot by firing squad in a secluded corner. The last was Joseph Jacobs, executed in 1941, the final man to die at the Tower. His chair still exists, a stark reminder that the Tower's shadow didn't disappear with the Tudors. Even in its final executions, the Tower maintained the ritual: final meals, blindfolds, protocols. But something had changed. The spectacle was gone. There were no crowds, no ceremonial garb, just silence. Bullets replaced blades. But the message remained the same. The Tower didn't just carry out executions, it turned them into statements. Each death served the monarchy, silencing not just individuals, but ideas, rebellion, heresy, ambition. It wasn't the number of lives taken that made Tower Green infamous. It was the precision with which they were erased. For all the precision, ritual and planning that surrounded executions at the Tower of London, not every death was swift or final when it should have been. Some were slow, clumsy and brutal. Others were interrupted at the last possible moment. But whether through error or politics, these were the moments where the system cracked, where death misfired. Few executions are more infamous or more horrifying than that of Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury. She was 67 years old when Henry VIII ordered her death. No trial, no confession, just a name on a list. Her only crime was being the last living Plantagenet with a claim to the throne. On the day of her execution in 1541, she was led to the scaffold on Tower Green. But she refused to kneel, refused to die quietly. Declaring she was no traitor, she ran. The executioner, young and untrained, panicked. He chased her in circles around the platform, swinging his axe wildly. It took 11 blows to kill her. Witnesses said the screams didn't stop until her body collapsed from blood loss. The executioner, reportedly named Alexander Burrell, resigned and disappeared from record. Some say he joined a monastery. Then there was the case of Sir Alexander Carew in 1645. A member of Parliament during the English Civil War, Carew was executed for plotting to betray the parliamentary cause. The executioner assigned to the task, Ralph Griffin, was either too nervous or too inexperienced. It took 4 strokes to remove Carew's head. The crowd, already agitated, began shouting and throwing objects. Griffin had to be escorted from the tower under armed guard. He never returned to the scaffold again. But not every execution failed because of a trembling hand. Sometimes they failed because the crown hesitated. Too late. In 1483, Sir James Tyrrell, allegedly involved in the murder of the princes in the Tower, was granted a full pardon at the moment his neck was laid bare on the block. The executioner had already raised his axe. The king's messenger arrived just in time. Or so they thought. The axe came down anyway, inches before the word "stop" rang through the air. The shock of the near miss or the psychological trauma of the moment reportedly turned Tyrrell's hair white overnight. Ironically, he would return to the same block years later, this time without reprieve. John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, met a similar fate in 1553. After placing Lady Jane Grey on the throne, he was captured and sentenced to die. As he mounted the scaffold, a royal messenger appeared, bearing what the crowd believed to be a pardon. But it wasn't. It was a delay. The crown wanted Dudley alive just long enough to witness the execution of his ally, Sir John Gates. Dudley was returned to his cell, forced to listen as Gates died outside. When he returned to the scaffold days later, no pardon arrived. He died with nothing left to hope for. Pardons could be tools of mercy or weapons of cruelty. And even when granted, they didn't always save the condemned. Communications were slow, protocols rigid. A delay of minutes could mean the difference between life and death. In some cases, pardons were revoked at the last second. During the reign of Mary I, several Protestant martyrs imprisoned in the Tower were promised clemency if they recanted. Some did. But their written confessions never reached court in time. Bureaucracy killed them. Their ashes, burned at the stake, didn't care that mercy was signed but undelivered. Other failures weren't political, they were mechanical. Executioners worked under pressure. A missed stroke meant more than just pain for the condemned. It could spark riots, panic, or revolt. That's why some executioners practiced on carcasses the night before or kept journals tracking each death. They had reputations to protect and sanity to preserve. Thomas Derrick, a 16th century hangman, became executioner after receiving a royal pardon for his own crimes. He accepted the role to avoid the noose and spent the rest of his life haunted by those he killed. In a diary discovered centuries later, he wrote, "Each night I see their faces, noble and common alike, in the moment before the blade falls. Even those hardened by repetition cracked. Edward Dennis, royal executioner under Elizabeth I, reportedly suffered a mental breakdown after executing the Earl of Essex in 1601. He retreated from public life for 3 months. His wife wrote to the Privy Council, "The weight of souls bears heavy upon him. He seeks solace in prayer and herbs." Because at the Tower of London, no execution ended with the final breath. The blade fell, but the weight remained. And in the rare moments when mercy came too late or cruelty dragged the sentence longer than death required, the Tower reminded everyone watching that control, not justice, was always the goal. It wasn't about how a man died, it was about who got to decide when. Not all executions at the Tower of London happened within its walls. In fact, most didn't. For the common man, the soldier, the spy, the rebel, death awaited just outside the fortress on Tower Hill. For the elite, the powerful, the inconvenient nobility, it happened in private, behind the walls, on Tower Green. The line between those two spaces wasn't just geography, it was class. Tower Hill was the theatre of public justice. Its scaffold stood high, 15 feet above the crowd, to ensure everyone could see. The message was blunt. This is what happens when you defy the crown. Executions there were spectacle, not punishment. Thousands gathered to witness the severing of heads. Vendors sold food. Children sat on shoulders. Nobles watched from horses. and always the shadow of the tower loomed behind, reminding everyone that death had a home. The permanent scaffold on Tower Hill was maintained by the City of London. Its annual upkeep, recorded in city ledgers, ran about £4 per year. It was a civic duty. Death, after all, was public business. In 1450, after the failed rebellion of Jack Cade, dozens of his followers were dragged through the streets and executed here. The crowds were so large, several spectators were crushed to death. No one paused the proceedings. The executions continued for days, each one as visible and visceral as the last. This was the punishment reserved for rebels, commoners, or anyone whose death was intended to serve as an example. The method was usually beheading, though hangings also took place depending on status and crime. If the condemned was lucky or connected, he'd get a sharp axe. If not, it might take more than one blow. Tower Hill didn't care about dignity, it cared about display. Tower Green, by contrast, was hidden behind stone and silence. Executions there were private, controlled, reserved for the upper class, often women of noble birth, whose deaths were considered too sensitive, too politically delicate, or too dangerous to be made public. Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, Lady Jane Grey. Each of them died on Tower Green. Each death was carefully orchestrated. The crowd hand-picked, the mood restrained, the block cleaned, the executioner rehearsed. The privacy was not a mercy, it was containment. A noblewoman's screams, heard by the wrong crowd, could spark outrage, sympathy, rebellion. The monarchy couldn't risk that. So it brought the execution indoors, where sound didn't travel and witnesses could be silenced. Tower Green itself measured roughly 33 feet by 24 feet, barely large enough to hold a scaffold and a handful of observers. The block was constructed by the tower's carpenter, John Ripley, who was paid £2 for each one. It was solid English oak, hand-carved with a shallow curve to cradle the neck. The executions followed a ritual. The condemned was allowed a final prayer, a final speech. Some forgave their executioners. Others looked them in the eye. Anne Boleyn famously knelt upright and never looked back. Lady Jane Grey carried a prayer book to the scaffold and clutched it until the moment her hands were guided to the block. But whether on the green or the hill, the tower maintained control over every step. Executioners were chosen not just for skill, but for loyalty. They followed strict guidelines, timing, posture, precision. Their tools were sharpened and tested in advance. Their garments were regulated. On ceremonial occasions, they wore black velvet hoods, not for anonymity, but as a symbol. A final visual confirmation that death was not personal. It was official. The divide between Tower Hill and Tower Green extended beyond ritual. It exposed the hierarchy of English justice. Nobles died quietly, out of sight. Commoners were paraded to the scaffold. The quality of one's death, like the quality of one's life, depended entirely on birth. That division wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. The monarchy needed to appear merciful even as it killed. Executing a queen on Tower Hill would have made her a martyr. Executing her on Tower Green made her a memory. Still, both places served the same function. They eliminated threats, they reaffirmed power, and they warned anyone watching, inside or outside the walls, that no one was above the axe. Even the dead knew their place. The graves inside the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula reflect this same structure. Nobles buried in marked tombs, commoners buried in mass graves beneath the floor. No names, no records, just bones and silence. The tower didn't invent this system. It inherited it, refined it, enforced it. But in doing so, it created one of the most chilling reminders in English history, that even in death, class decides everything. Tower Hill was loud, Tower Green was quiet, but neither left room for mercy, only order. At the Tower of London, death was never the end. For centuries it claimed the living, queens, poets, children, rebels. But the dead didn't leave quietly. They lingered, in shadows, in doorways, in echoes that never seemed to fade. Because when a place witnesses nearly 1,000 years of executions, torture, betrayal, and psychological torment, silence doesn't follow. Something else does. The Tower is one of the most haunted places in Britain, and not just by reputation. Its ghosts have names, dates, and dozens of written sightings spanning centuries. In most castles, ghosts are legend. In the Tower, they're documented. The most famous of all is Anne Boleyn, executed in 1536 after being accused of treason, adultery, and incest. She died on Tower Green, beheaded by a French swordsman summoned for the occasion. But her presence didn't die with her. Dozens of yeoman warders, beefeaters, have reported seeing her ghost over the years. Sometimes she walks headless across the green. Other times she's seen in the Queen's house, standing silently by a window or gliding across the upper corridor. In 1864, a guard claimed to see her standing at the chapel door. When he approached, she turned, and her face vanished. He resigned the next morning. Anne's spirit appears most often in May, near the anniversary of her death. Some say she looks peaceful, others say her expression is frozen in fear. But all agree, she never speaks. Lady Jane Grey, the 9-day Queen, is another regular. Executed at just 17 years old in 1554, she was buried nearby after being beheaded on Tower Green. In 1957, 23 tourists claimed to see a pale girl in Tudor dress kneeling in the early morning mist, holding a small black book. She vanished before anyone could approach. In 1972, a beefeater assigned to patrol the chapel area alone refused to return after seeing a girl weeping behind the scaffold. Her spirit appears most often on the date of her execution, February 12th. The Tower's most tragic hauntings belong to the princes. Edward V, aged 12, and his brother Richard, aged 9, disappeared in 1483. Most believe they were murdered on Richard III's orders. Their bones were discovered centuries later, but their story didn't end with burial. Guards at the Bloody Tower, where the boys were last seen, have heard soft footsteps, children's laughter, and crying late into the night. One 1953 report involved 2 separate guards seeing the same 2 boys dressed in nightshirts standing near a window. When questioned, both men gave identical descriptions. Neither returned to night duty again. Sir Walter Raleigh, imprisoned in the Bloody Tower for over a decade, is said to haunt his old study. He was an alchemist and scholar, conducting scientific experiments during his confinement. Guards have reported the scent of pipe smoke lingering in the air, despite no smoking allowed anywhere in the tower. One visitor in 2018, a physicist attending a conference, claimed to hear Latin being whispered behind the locked door of Raleigh's study. He opened it. No one was there. Then there's the White Lady. Her name is lost to time, but her presence is constant. She is seen in the White Tower, often standing near the staircase. Witnesses describe a woman in a long veil, her face obscured. One guard in 1975 reportedly collapsed after encountering her, claiming he felt her look inside his mind. In his report to the Tower Constable, he wrote, "She looked at me without eyes, only sorrow." Some hauntings aren't visible but felt. Sudden drops in temperature, the weight of unseen eyes, objects moved, doors unlocked, cold spots that linger in rooms with no drafts. Tower staff call it the pressure, a sense of being watched, especially in the chapel and the Bloody Tower. The Beauchamp Tower, once used as a prison, is also notorious. One yeoman warder claimed to hear someone reciting prayers in Latin from an empty room. Visitors have reported being touched, hearing whispers, or feeling intense dread. In 1990, a nun visiting from Wales took a photo of what she thought was an empty cell. When developed, it showed two shadows side by side. Analysis by the British Paranormal Society found electromagnetic activity levels consistent with sustained paranormal events. Even the animals never fully left. The medieval menagerie once held lions, monkeys, and even a polar bear gifted by Norway's king. Today, guards report hearing animal growls near the old enclosure site. Motion sensors have gone off with no physical presence. Claw marks have appeared and vanished from stone walls. In 2024, during a renovation of the Queen's House, 5 construction workers claimed they experienced a time slip. For several minutes, they said, everything changed: the smell, the light, the sounds. They reported seeing furniture from the Tudor era and even saw a woman in a white shift, believed to be Catherine Howard, running through the corridor and screaming. All 5 men documented the event separately. Each report matched. Whether one believes in ghosts or not, the records at the tower are consistent, long-standing, and eerily precise. And the stories don't come from tourists chasing legends. They come from guards, workers, and military officials, many of whom had no interest in the supernatural until they experienced it. What haunts the tower is not just the past. It's the inability to forget. The sheer weight of lives lost, unjustly or violently, left something behind, not spirits seeking revenge, but memories refusing to rest. Because the Tower of London doesn't just contain history. It contains everything history tried to bury. The Tower of London still stands, unshaken, unmoved. Not because it was the strongest fortress ever built or the most beautiful, but because it did something few structures ever manage. It adapted, it endured, and more than anything, it remembered. Across nearly 1,000 years it has been many things: a palace, a prison, a mint, a menagerie, a museum. But beneath every transformation, its true function never changed. It was a symbol of power, of warning, of finality. Every stone, every iron bar, every timber beam has served the same purpose: to remind the living what happens when you challenge the crown. And the method of that reminder? Death. Not chaotic or random, but calculated, choreographed, dignified in some places, brutal in others. At Tower Green it came dressed in black hoods and velvet gowns. At Tower Hill it came loud, messy, public, but in both cases the message was the same. Control doesn't need to shout, it only needs to end you. What made the tower truly terrifying wasn't how many people died within its walls. It was who died, and how intentionally their deaths were delivered. Queens, lords, scholars, spies, children, some innocent, some guilty, all silenced by the same blade, fired upon by the same rifles, buried beneath the same chapel stones. But the tower's legacy isn't just a record of executions. It's a monument to the systems that made those executions necessary. The cold machinery of monarchy, the tension between church and crown, the paranoia of political succession, and always, always, the obsession with loyalty. A king could forgive an enemy, but a traitor, never. And so the tower became the holding tank for the inconvenient. It wasn't filled with monsters, it was filled with reminders. Reminders that power was not to be questioned, that justice didn't have to look like fairness, that silence could be enforced, one swing of the axe at a time. Yet somehow the silence never held. Carved into its walls are names that refuse to disappear. Whispered across centuries are prayers that were never fully silenced. Caught in the chill of its corridors are stories that refuse to rest. That's why the tower haunts, not because of superstition, but because of memory. Memory that lingers in the blood-soaked wood of the scaffold, in the hollow ache of empty cells, in the prayer books left behind, in the footsteps no one claims. This is a place that remembers even when no one asks it to. And today, millions walk its halls each year. They stare into glass cases holding the crown jewels. They pose for pictures by the White Tower. They listen to beefeaters tell stories of queens and ghosts. But beneath the history lesson lies something deeper, an unease that never fully lifts. Because if the tower teaches anything, it's that civilization is thin. It's one step from banquet to cell, one word from wedding to execution, one rumor from royal to traitor. That's the tower's truth, not just its past, but its warning. In an age where power is softer, less visible, more polite, the tower is a reminder that once it wasn't. Once it wore a crown and carried an axe. Once it could decide your fate not in a courtroom, but in a corridor lit by torchlight. And once it didn't have to justify itself to anyone. There are few places in the world where history feels alive. The tower is one of them. Not because it's preserved, but because it still speaks. You don't need a ghost to feel it. Just silence. Just a moment alone near the scaffold. Just one glance at a prisoner's scratched name. The fear is still there. The authority. The finality. But so is the resistance. So is the courage of the condemned. So is the defiance carved into stone. The tower doesn't belong to the kings and queens who used it. It belongs to the ones who never left, to the voices it tried to erase, and to the generations who now walk through its gates, not as prisoners, but as witnesses. The scaffold is gone. The executions are over. But the memory? That never left. And maybe that's the tower's last act of power. Not to kill, but to remember. The Tower of London was never just a fortress. It was a message, chiseled in stone, sharpened by steel and soaked in blood. Every corner of it carries weight. The gate where prisoners entered, the green where queens fell, the chapel where their bodies were buried in silence. None of it is accidental. Every shadow, every brick, every cold gust of wind is a reminder. Power leaves scars. But even now, centuries later, the tower hasn't finished speaking. It still stands not because time has forgotten its darkness, but because we haven't. Because no matter how many coins were minted or kings were crowned, it's the executions, the betrayals, and the ghosts that remain etched into our collective memory. This is where history refuses to be cleaned up. It refuses to be polite. It just is, raw, brutal, unforgettable. It's a place where silence speaks louder than trumpets, and the wind seems to carry names that were never meant to be remembered. And if you've made it this far, maybe you feel it too. So now we want to hear from you. Which part of the tower's dark past struck you the most? Was it the precision of the executioners? The final words of the condemned? Or the ghosts that still walk the grounds today? Let us know in the comments below. And if this journey into Britain's blood-stained past kept you locked in, give this video a like, subscribe for more stories from history's underbelly, and share it with someone who thinks castles are just tourist traps. Because here, behind these walls, history never died. It just waits. And the tower? It always remembers.